We are back. Welcome to the Leadership Launchpad Project. I'm Rob Kalvarowski, and always the yin to my yang. Wearing black today, Susan Hobson. Susan, how are you?
I am doing okay. And you were so funny for calling me out of the black because you definitely see that color psychology, don't you?
It's the only time you ever wear black.
Yeah, it's been a heavy week in the news up here north of the border, which I know we're going to get into in another podcast. But yeah, maybe not as high flying on a Friday as I'm used to because of that fact.
It's unfortunate for that. But as always, let's start off with a quote. And I have one here from Martin Luther King Jr. And he says, "We need leaders not in love with money, but in love with justice. Not in love with publicity, but in love with humanity."
Love that quote. I love that quote. Tell us why you chose that particular quote for today, though.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to talk today a lot about a great research paper out of MIT around the reasons for people resigning. And spoiler alert, it's not all about money. So, on that note, we have a special guest with us today, Charlie Sull, the co-founder at Culture X and the author of a MIT Sloan Management Review article called "Toxic Culture is Driving the Great Resignation." Charlie, how are you?
I'm doing great, Rob. How are you?
I'm great. And let's get into it. For people out there, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Do you want the long or the short version?
The long version.
Okay. Yeah. So I grew up in Boston and England, actually. So my dad, who's now my co-founder, is a professor. He was teaching at between Harvard and London Business School. So I was kind of an academic rat, kind of moving back and forth. And I was always very interested in literature from a young age. I remember my friends, we would be on spring break in Ibiza, and they'd all be, drinking by the pool, and I would be reading John Milton and these epic poems. So when I got to college, I went into college wanting to be an epic poet. That was my career aspiration, and I pretty quickly learned that. That's not a viable career path these days, for better or worse. So I tried to do the next best thing. I became very interested in screenwriting. I joined this comedy society, the Harvard Lampoon, which I later became president of. And yeah, my goal is to be a comedy writer, write Curb Your Enthusiasm, shows like that. So I went out to Hollywood for a couple of years, tried to do that, got an agent, got pretty close to a couple of jobs, but it didn't work out as quickly as I liked. So I kind of shifted gears, and then fast forward a few years. Now I had co-founded this boutique strategy execution firm that so we were working mostly with senior leadership of very large companies, and we did tons of these engagements, helping companies become kind of more agile and improve their strategy execution, a couple strategy development projects, things like that. But the day everything kind of changed for me career-wise is we were doing an engagement with the senior leadership of the Gates Foundation. And this was a little bit different for us because most of our clients were these really big companies, Fortune 500 companies. They had a lot of publicly available information about them. So it was relatively easy to prepare for one of these engagements because you knew so much about the company. With the Gates Foundation, it was different. They're a smaller organization. And they're private. So there's not too much you can learn about them on the internet. The one resource we had, and we were just experimenting with this, was kind of the new days of this, was Glassdoor. So we found about 100 or 150 employee reviews about the Gates Foundation on Glassdoor. And Don and I, my father and co-founder, we just kind of manually coded them, looking for all these academically rich topics, psychological safety, empowerment, bureaucracy, all these things that might be culturally relevant and also strategically relevant. And this was a new thing for us, so we were a little bit, worried, would this approach work? Would this add value? We presented, and the first thing they said was, "We'll stop you right there. We actually just did a large culture culture engagement to investigate our culture. This was a major endeavor. It was, a mid six-figure engagement. So we think we already know about culture, but go on. So we were like, oh, crap. All right. So we presented from this Glassdoor analysis. We had found 5 cultural salient topics that we thought might help them, and we presented the topics. And at the end, they said, well, that's kind of interesting because this large engagement we did actually found 4 topics, and they were the same topics. And actually now we're kind of worried that we missed out on this 5th topic that you found on Glassdoor. So we thought, that's kind of interesting. It seems like if you can understand the employee voice, their natural language, when they feel safe speaking up about the company, you can actually find these insights that can be incredibly valuable to organizations. So we tried this out in a couple other clients, and we got pretty similar results. It was, it added a lot of value. So the next step was, what if we could do this at scale? Because it's very time consuming, to read through all these Glassdoor reviews and code them into these topics and find insights to them. What if we could build a machine that could do it for us? And I found this very, very interesting, right? So this kind of reawakened this interest in language that I always had, but now it wasn't creative writing. It was kind of the opposite. It was a machine learning how to kind of think like a business school professor, basically. So Don and I became very interested in this, kind of obsessed by this, and we struck up a relationship. We were friends with the chief economist at Glassdoor, and we struck up this relationship where they gave us their data, and we used their data as well as some other data sources to create a project called the Culture 500, which is what this research you were talking about stems out of. All our research stems out of this. It's the largest systematic study of organizational culture ever conducted. So it looks at millions of Glassdoor reviews and basically does what we did for the Gates Foundation, except at scale. And so we worked on that for a number of years, and that's what led to my current research, and also what led to my company, CultureX.
I love this. And this is something, obviously we have to nerd out about this, but, let's talk about that a little bit. What were some of the things that you noticed, especially in your first one where you're literally looking through manually the reviews?
There's so much. It's hard to know where to start. So CultureX measures hundreds of different cultural topics. Employees can speak about a very, very wide range of topics. But I guess what I'll say is, you can tell, even just reading them, some of these topics matter more than others. And we've actually proven that. This is actually related to this research paper that we're doing now. When you look at the impact that a topic has on the overall Glassdoor rating, some topics have a much higher impact than others. So employees can be critical about the company in 100 different ways, right? They can say it's too bureaucratic, not innovative enough, not pet friendly enough. They can have a variety of complaints. Most of these criticisms aren't going to have a significant dent on the Glassdoor rating. Compensation, for instance, very, very frequently mentioned, but it doesn't tend to have a huge negative impact on the Glassdoor rating, slight impact. However, there are a special group of topics that we call the Toxic 5, where it's very different. And you can actually just tell this just simply by reading the reviews and connecting to the reviewer on a human level. When reviewers mention these topics of toxicity, you can sense a strong, visceral, emotive, negative reaction. And this plays out when you do the analysis systematically. It turns out that these handful of topics, the Toxic 5, have a very significant negative impact on overall company rating.
And may I be so bold as to ask about the Toxic 5, Charlie?
Of course, yeah. So that was our last research paper that Yeah, it goes into when you talk about toxic culture, what exactly do you mean? So our methodology here is we analyze all these hundreds of topics like, compensation, work-life balance. Most of them have a slight negative impact on the Glassdoor rating, but the toxic five can it's a cluster of five themes. They are non-inclusive. So this can be things like racial equity, gender equity, disabled equity, LGBTQ equity. It can also just be simply a non-inclusive atmosphere or favoritism or cronyism or nepotism. So that there's that bundle, and that's actually the most frequently cited marker of toxicity. And then you have disrespect, which is incredibly important. So when employees talk about being disrespected, their language is often things like, "I'm treated like a cog in the machine. I'm treated like an animal. I'm treated like dirt." All these topics about basically being treated like less than a human and not having their dignity valued. So that's another topic. The third is ethical. And this is a word employees frequently use here is shady. The company is shady, management is dishonest, and it can go all the way to things like regulatory noncompliance and outright fraud. It's actually very interesting. If you look at the Glassdoor reviews of Wells Fargo, from even a couple of years before the scandal broke, you could predict that there was something very fishy going on in that company just by looking at employee reviews, because topics like regulatory compliance and ethics were completely out of line with the industry. So that's ethical, and then there's cutthroat competition. So this is basically normally the environment is so political or just generally unconducive to collaboration. So a lot of these quotes are things like, "My coworkers are out to get me," or "There's a lot of gossip in the organization." I get stabbed in the back. A lot of politicism, things like that. Just a very unhealthy form of collaboration. And then the fifth is just outright abusive behavior, which you see too much of on Glassdoor. It's things like, the manager yells at me, the manager is a bully, the manager is a jerk, things like that.
Is it fair to say, sorry, Rob, that the thing that connects all of those things is the way that they make their people feel?
Yeah, I think that's definitely an aspect of it. I mean, one way to think of the toxic five is these are a series of criticisms you have about the company that you take home with you, right? So if if the company's too bureaucratic, you could just go home at the end of the day and it's not going to really affect you that much on an emotional level. But if you've been disrespected at work or you feel like your coworkers are out to get you, that's something that's going to take its toll on you even after you leave the office. And actually, there's a lot of research that experiencing a toxic culture can increase the risk of major disease, so things like heart attack, cancer, very serious diseases, by 33 to 50%. So this comes home with you.
Yeah, it's actually something. Yeah.
Go ahead. I know what you're saying. We had to ask because it connects to what we're trying to prove on this show, right? Which is that how we treat our people relationally matters, right? How we make them feel. Sorry, Rob, go ahead.
No, I was just digging into that research myself, and I found a paper out of University of Southern Australia, I think. But they had some research saying that toxic culture increases depression by 300% and also increases your risk of stroke and heart attack, or death from stroke and heart attack. So it's all aligned there. And yeah, it's something I think we all kind of realized, but now that we're starting to see the actual impact, it's horrifying.
Yeah, I mean, it's a epidemic that people don't talk about that much. I mean, by our estimates, about 10 million Americans, maybe more than that, experience the toxic culture every day.
Wow. And so maybe let's go there. Like 10 million Americans, like how many companies is that roughly?
Well, every company, every large organization experiences toxicity to some extent. It's a spectrum. So even we like to use the example of St. Jude Children's Hospital, which I have nothing but nice things to say about their culture. It's literally saintly. I mean, it's employees are very happy there. We actually did a feature called the Culture Champions, which looked at one of the healthiest cultures in America. They were one of them. Basically, a very, very strong culture. Even there, about 2 or 3% of their employees, which amounts to hundreds of people, experience toxicity. So even if you have, and we can talk about kind of the factors that go into fixing a toxic culture and creating a healthy culture, but even if you get a lot of them right, for instance, senior leadership does a good job, they instill the right values, distributed leaders are for the most part good, social norms are healthy, and so on. In large organizations, you can still have these pockets of toxicity that will affect, a non-significant portion of the population.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh yeah, so it's something that affects every single, at least large organization, and it actually affects small organizations more than a large organization. So you see when you study toxicity by organization size, when you have very small organizations, so say 1 to about 50 people, the toxicity is relatively low, and we think what's going on there is there's kind of a family effect. Everyone knows each other. They're pretty close social bonds, so you're maybe have less toxic behavior. But then the danger point sort of is when you get to kind of the 100 to 500 person size. That's where you see toxicity spiking. And we think what's going on here is when you have that size of a company, these social bonds kind of erode a little bit. You can't necessarily know everyone in the company, or at least know them well. And you also haven't installed these guardrails like a professional HR department that's going to curb some of this toxic behavior. So actually, it's that size of company where toxicity is most pronounced on average. And then once you become a larger organization, once you get to the thousands or 10,000 plus size, then you see a real reduction in toxicity. And we think what's going on there is because you have, you've installed better processes, better human resource processes for dealing with bad behavior. But even for very large companies, you see incredible variance at the company level. So for the Culture 500 sample, which is more than 500 of the largest employers in America, you see levels of toxicity varying from 2 or 3% of employees are citing this negatively to, in a couple of cases, 20 or 25% of employees are citing this negatively.
Wow, these numbers are nuts. The policies let's talk about how we start to intervene on a toxic culture if we know that it's actually going on behind our gates. Where do we begin? It seems like such a daunting prospect, I know, for a lot of the leaders that I work with when this very topic even comes up.
Yeah, so this is actually what we're writing about in our forthcoming paper, and our methodology here is large-scale literature review. So we looked at over 1,000 studies of toxicity and how to fix it, and synthesized them. And the research is actually pretty clear. So toxic culture it's hard to make an impact on this on an individual level, right? So if you have a manager who's being disrespectful to you, you can go tell your HR representative. Maybe they'll deal with it. Maybe they won't. What we're more interested in is how do you change this on a systemic level? And in order to do that, you have to get a couple of things right. So it's an interdependent series of relationships based on the absolute top team, normally the CEO, him or herself. Getting their buy-in is critical for reasons that we'll see. Then distributed leaders, so middle managers. Then social norms, which both senior leaders and distributed leaders help create. And then there's a lot of evidence that your work environment or work design it can be either conducive or not conducive to toxicity. So there are a couple elements of work design around workload. If workload's too high, if employees are stressed out, they're going to be more likely to let their negative impulses shine, and that can lead to toxicity. If there's ambiguity in the role, that can also increase stress, and stress increases toxicity. So doing things like giving regular positive feedback is one way, reducing workload is one way, increasing empowerment is one way. And this is all underpinned by cultural measurement. So cultural measurement matters for quite a few reasons. Maybe, well, one of the more important ones is to actually get this on the CEO's radar. Because if the CEO doesn't care about this and can't enforce these positive social norms, redesign work, address toxic behavior at the distributed manager level, then the overall culture change doesn't have much chance of succeeding. So if you can speak the CEO's language, and they're going to be more likely to be persuaded by data, that's going to really help. And then also measurement is just important for identifying where in the organization things are going right or things are going wrong, where you should intervene, what kinds of toxicity are prevalent, which will affect the course of the intervention. Which individual leaders are exhibiting this toxicity. So one of the cool things you can do with advanced cultural measurement now is go for a manager level and read a lot of 360 reviews, read what their peers, superiors, direct reports say are their strengths and the challenges, and then analyze them with AI. And it turns out this is an incredibly effective way for identifying managers who exhibit high levels of toxicity. In fact, what we find most of the time is that about 5% of managers will account for about half of the overall toxicity in the organization. So identifying this 5% and addressing that behavior, and there are a couple of things you can do there. One of the simplest and often most powerful is simply making managers aware of how their behavior affects others. It turns out if you can just communicate that, that's often enough to make a dent on the behavior. And then if that doesn't work, then coaching can be very effective. And sometimes, you need more severe ways to address the problem. But you need to address that problem. And if you can find those 5% of managers, that's one of the highest impact things you can do to improve the culture.
That's incredible. 5% or 50% of the toxicity. Now, I guess going that far, so you mentioned that the CEOs want data. Have you done anything around the productivity or profitability correlations with toxicity?
Yeah, I mean, there's a very, very strong business case for toxicity. So I would say there's often also an ethical case, but yeah, for the business case, the two strongest things, one, toxicity is, as we can discuss a couple of papers ago, is the number one driver of attrition during the Great Resignation. So it's a huge, huge driver on attrition. This is incredibly costly to companies. If you lose people, it can cost 2 to 3 times their salary to replace them. Plus, you lose their knowledge. It disrupts the company. It's just very disruptive and costly. And two, toxicity is the number one negative driver of Glassdoor reviews. So this matters for your employer brand. If you're wondering why are you getting all these 1 and 2 star reviews on Glassdoor that are stopping people from wanting to apply to work for your company and accept the job offer, toxicity is the number one culprit almost always. And so it matters for employer brand, it matters for talent attraction, but also Glassdoor reviews are indicative of overall employee satisfaction, which is closely linked to engagement. And there's all sorts of research about engagement and profitability and productivity and so forth.
We definitely have seen that, hey, over the last 2 years, talking about this theme here on the show. I'm curious about the empowerment piece, because we talk about it so much as being a real pillar of leadership 2.0. And so I'm curious, how do you empower your employees to speak up about this sort of thing if they're privy to it before it makes it onto a Glassdoor rating?
Yeah, well, psychological safety is, there are two things going on, empowerment and psychological safety. Psychological safety is very, very, it's kind of the secret sauce of culture. So a lot of times people ask me, what's the most important cultural thing to get right? I always say, There is no right answer in every situation. It depends on the company's situation, which is true. That's our approach. But if there was one unifying theme, I would probably choose psychological safety. So going back to the culture champions, we took the Culture 500 sample and selected the 21 superstars. And when you look at across all different facets of culture, so some of them succeed more on the employee experience, integrity, respect, and so forth. Others succeed on agility, innovation, performance, and so forth. The one thing that all of them had in common when you analyzed, when you analyzed hundreds of different topics, what was the single thing that they all agreed on, that they all did well? It was psychological safety. And it's just incredibly important because for a variety, psychological safety is very necessary for a variety of changes. If you're undergoing an internal transformation or you're trying to become better at diversity and inclusion, having these difficult conversations, or even just if you're trying to succeed in a new market, especially in a recession where there are all sorts of changes going on and you have to adapt to new circumstances, anytime you're trying to make these changes, that's going to lead to potentially difficult decisions. And if you don't have the ability to speak up and say, actually, this isn't working, then it can be very hard to make those changes successfully. Psychological safety is very important to cultivate, and it's important to hear the employee voice when they feel safe to speak up. So this also goes into things like survey design, which is often the first step for companies who really struggle with this and do experience toxicity. It's designing a survey that actually allows them to speak up, just like that they can speak up on Glassdoor and nip these problems in the bud before they do appear on Glassdoor.
So what would that survey look like? Like I've worked in corporate, and like everyone always reports 85% engagement when clearly it's not that high. Like how do you design what would someone out there want to put in the survey to make sure that they're getting good results?
Well, you want to hear the employee voice. You want to hear their natural language. It's difficult to make sense of the culture from a lengthy engagement survey or a 1 to 5 point scale engagement survey, which is by far the most common technique right now. So if you have something like that, if you have, dozens of questions, one on, psychological safety, one on work-life balance, you try to understand everything with these 36 questions. Employees just go on autopilot. So pretty much every survey we see, about 70% of employees are answering every single question with either the same answer or two answers. And these are across a wide variety of topics. There should be 5 different answers there. So they just go on autopilot. And as a result, you see very little variance in the questions. You can't get a rich cultural picture. Versus if you ask employees in their own words, what matters to you, what's working well, what's not working well, they reveal not only their sentiment about topics, is work-life balance succeeding or failing, they also reveal how top of mind it is to them. And that's actually the more important piece of information a lot of times. It's actually, not only is this going well, but does it actually matter to you? The survey we recommend is very simple. It's actually modeled after Glassdoor, and you just have a couple of questions, overall rating of the company. You can do a couple questions on engagement to get some sense of, is this going well or not? And then simply, what are the pros of working here? What are the cons of working here? What is your advice to management? And it turns out if you do that very simple survey, which can take only, 3 minutes to fill out, not burdensome, and you give employees psychological safety. So you give them the assurance that writing their candid feedback isn't going to come back to hurt them. You can get incredibly powerful and rich results that can be used to change the culture.
And what about if you're trying to do this upstream, right? Like if you're a relatively new business who's looking at creating this type of championship culture, I think we're describing, right? What are some of the tips that you would have for those leaders that are out there listening?
Yeah, so It depends because, different companies are going to be in different situations. And our approach is always to look at this holistically, take into account what your strategy is, what your market conditions are, what your employees are saying. So there isn't necessarily one path to cultural success, but I would say that installing good listening systems, installing good measurement systems from the get-go is very important to allow for changes of any kind.
Makes sense to me. And then how about, I have another question in and around how all of this disruption over the last 2 years of the pandemic, moving so many businesses into a hybrid model, how do you foresee that affecting people's culture? And maybe there's some things that leaders should be aware of in terms of what they're up against there. Because it's harder to hear and see your people is what my leaders keep telling me in the chair, right? When it's remote, at least the ones that have never done that before in any way, shape, or form. So I'm just curious how we can help them with a little bit of advice.
Yeah, we're very interested in that topic. We're trying to find a really good data set, a large scale data set, so we can approach it like we do Culture 500. So we're still figuring out the answers, but one thing that is for certain is remote work is incredibly popular with employees. 89% of employees say they want at least some remote work. When you look at employee preferences, it appears to be a consensus that employees want about 2 days of in-office work and 3 days of remote work. So I think and I hope that the future of work will evolve to the employee's benefit. On the other hand, it does seem like there could be some challenges now employees will face, particularly around collaboration. But I can't say too much more than that. I mean, it's still something we're investigating.
What's the future of leadership look like to you?
That's a big question. I mean, I hope it's, more humane and less toxic and everything. But of course, that's, contingent on the labor market. If right now it's an incredibly friendly to employee labor market, which could shift over the next few years. I mean, it's a big question. I don't have all the answers. The one small domain that I think I could add value on is I think we will, as tools continue to develop, I think we'll get better at assessing leadership strengths and challenges and better matching them to success profiles. I think we'll get a better sense of, for any given position in an organization, what are the traits that are going to facilitate success and hinder success, and who are the leaders who exhibit those traits, and do a better job of matching, which I think will overall improve the state of business and improve organizations' ability to succeed.
Do you have a sense on those traits yet?
There are so many. I mean, it's kind of my same answer to how do you change a culture? It depends on the culture. So we measure hundreds of these leadership traits, and they're wide variety. Anything you can imagine that employees write about in their feedback. And depending on the specific circumstance, different traits are going to matter. So the question isn't, what are these universal traits that are going to win for every leadership situation? Because, impossible. I mean, people would say John Lennon was a great leader of the Beatles, and a lot of people would say Angela Merkel was a great chancellor of Germany, completely different traits. So different situations are going to require different traits. But I think what we will do a better job of in the future is using data to determine what those traits are and to match them with the suitable leaders.
Makes sense to me. We got to ask while we have you here. This is our favorite question, Charlie. What do you want the legacy of all of this incredible game-changing research you and your father are doing over there at Culture X to be?
I want to improve so many cultures for so many employees that they will write songs about me.
First day, Rob?
We've never heard that one before.
Write a poem. Write a poem about me.
No, I love that. And Charlie, for folks out there, if they want to engage your work at Culture X, where can they find you?
CultureX.com.
And what does your typical engagement look like?
So a lot of the times we'll start with a culture diagnostic because no two cultures are alike. So we'll analyze different types of employee data. So this can be external data, or it can be an engagement survey or 360 reviews, and we'll analyze that text at scale with the insight of a business school professor, and then depending on the various objectives, common objectives include increasing retention, increasing engagement, aligning culture to strategy, becoming more agile, becoming more innovative, what have you. Depending on those objectives, we find ways to achieve the objectives based on employee feedback. I'm sorry, I can't be more specific than that, but our engagements they vary a lot.
No, I love this. And yeah, for folks out there, you can find him culturex.com. We'll also drop Charlie's LinkedIn in the podcast notes so you can connect with him there. Susan, is there anything you want folks to take away from today?
I love this interview. Awareness comes before intelligence. You can't solve what you don't acknowledge, folks. And hello, if you're going to start acknowledging what's going on in your culture, of course, you got to measure it. And now we have a resource for that. I'm so happy we brought Charlie in today. Thank you so much for breaking that all down for us, statistically speaking. That really helps us make the case over here at the Leadership Launchpad Project, right?
Yeah, glad to hear it. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, and for us, please head on over to the Leadership Launchpad Project on your favorite podcast platform and hit subscribe. And if you're looking for any leadership development programs or coaching, head on over to elitehighperformance.com. And for me, what I want folks to take away is that this technology and natural language processing is possible, right? And I spent a lot of my career reading manual work order entries with data, and there's a better way, right? And it's the same thing. It's like setting it up for success, either at the beginning or running those now to get the data you need to make informed choices. And Charlie broke it down for us is like toxic culture is 10.7 times more predictive than money when we're talking about people leaving. And so this is incredibly important, not to mention their personal health, mental health, and all the other stuff. So this is super important. Get on it, folks. Charlie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Everyone, thanks for listening, and we'll see you all next week.
Bye, everyone.